He'll speak on the subject of morality, the United States, and world politics. He asked for flexibility in his topic. Our topic tonight is no less broad. It's prospects for United States-Soviet relations. Our guest is one of us in a sense. He's in several senses. He's a native of Baltimore. He's the nephew of the late Louis Azrael, who is known to many of you for his by his columns in the News American. He is the son of Mr. and Mrs. Maurice Azrael, who are charter members of this council and who are known to many of you by face and voice, if not in person. Let me ask that Mr. and Mrs. Azrael just very briefly stand so you can make an association. If you would, please. And I'm sorry I didn't warn them in advance that I was doing this. Louis Azrael had a link to this council as well. He was one of the founding trustees of this organization. Our guest is both a scholar and a practitioner, a serious specialist in Soviet affairs. He's a graduate of Harvard College, 1956. His PhD is from Harvard University, 1961. He taught at the University of Chicago for almost 2 decades. And I can vouch for his competence, having been a student in one of his classes at one time. His books and monographs are impressive. They include Managerial Power in Soviet Politics, East-West Relations, Controlling Long-Term Conflict, and Soviet Nationality Policies and Practices. He's also published in some of the nation's most prestigious journals. He has served with one of the government's best-known agencies. He has, from 1981 to 1985, he was on the Secretary of State's Policy Planning Council. He is now a senior staff member and specialist in Soviet affairs at the Rand Corporation in California. We look forward to his observations on prospects for U.S.-Soviet relations. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to present to you now Dr. Jeremy R. Azrael.
Hi, Ma, don't you? What football players do. Thanks, Frank. It's one nice thing about being here is that I can count on an audience that won't laugh at my accent, which is really very unusual. I mean, you should take Baltimore accents on the road as often as I do, and you get lots of comments, and it's nice to know that I won't have to put up with them today. As the printed title of my talk indicates, I want to focus this evening on current and emergent trends in U.S.-Soviet relations. But by way of a sort of scene setter, I want to remind you of the basic guidelines by which the Reagan administration, and that's what I want to take as my point of departure, by which the basic strategic guidelines by which the Reagan administration has insisted that U.S.-Soviet relations ought to be conducted. And these guidelines were most clearly stated by George Shultz in 1982 when he called for a U.S. strategy that relied on realism and strength and negotiation. Those are guidelines to which I have some vested interest in. I should confess, having written the testimony in which he set them forth, but to which I also describe. And what Secretary Shultz had in mind when he called for a strategy based on realism was, above all, a strategy that recognized the illusions of détente for what they were. That is to say, recognized them as examples of wishful thinking about our ability to achieve a normalization of U.S.-Soviet relations through self-denying ordinances and through unilateral concessions and through so-called cooperative measures. It was essential, according to the Secretary, that we face up to the implications of the fact that Moscow had been spending 13 to 15% of its GNP on military programs for the past 15 years, including the years of détente, when the international environment was unprecedentedly reassuring and non-threatening from Moscow's point of view. It was also essential to face up to the fact that Moscow showed no signs whatever of evolving into a status quo power, let alone of entering what you might call the post-imperial age. Moscow's determination to enforce Soviet control over the countries of Eastern Europe showed no signs of weakening, and its expansion into the Third World was proceeding at an accelerating pace and taking increasingly aggressive forms, witness, among other things, its invasion and ruthless occupation of Afghanistan. So in sum, Moscow continued to give every indication that it meant precisely what it said when it characterized the superpower relationship as a zero-sum contest for control of the global correlation of forces. Moscow seemed determined to vindicate its self-proclaimed right to play the role of security manager not only in Eastern Europe, but in any region that it decided was close to its borders. And it was interesting looking at the communications that were going on at the time that Moscow regularly referred to its rights in areas close to its borders. The only place it didn't include, and never included in communications as close to its borders, was Central America. Everywhere else in the world, Moscow claimed a right. Central America was omitted in what was a clear offer of a trade, a sphere of influence trade, but we won't go into that right now. Now, faced with this kind of challenge, Secretary Shultz asserted it was crucial that the West in general, and that the U.S. in particular, rebuild the strength that had been allowed to dwindle during the late 1960s and 1970s. In the first place, it was essential to redress the military balance, which had tilted disturbingly in Moscow's favor as a result of the relentless Soviet military buildup that had accompanied détente. In the second place, and perhaps even more importantly, we had to refurbish our badly damaged credibility as a friend and as an ally. We had to alleviate Allied doubts about the reliability of the U.S. security commitment to Western Europe, doubts that had been strongly reinforced by the neutron bomb fiasco of 1977, for those of you who remember that. And we had to allay third world fears that the U.S. had become a paper tiger, fears that had been quickened by our failure to protect our vital state in Iran. In sum, it was imperative that we recover and be seen to have recovered both the capability and the resolve to compete effectively in a protracted superpower competition. Finally, according to Secretary Shultz, our approach to the Soviet Union had to include a constant readiness to seek negotiated solutions to common problems. Negotiations, Shultz insisted, were indispensable not only because domestic and allied publics demand them, but also because negotiations could reduce the risk of superpower confrontation. But agreements were not to be treated as desirable in their own right. The illusions of détente were behind us, and we would henceforth insist on agreements that were equitable and that were verifiable and that made a genuine contribution to Western security and to international stability by providing, for example, for substantial reductions in the Soviet arsenal of highly destabilizing first-strike weapons, SS-18s, SS-19s, if any of you are military buffs. Furthermore, we would insist that geopolitical issues and human rights have as high a priority on our negotiating agenda as the arms control issues that had previously and unwarrantedly been given pride of place. We wouldn't attempt to enforce a futile and self-defeating policy of linkage, the sort of policy that had led President Carter to respond to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan by withdrawing from Senate consideration an arms control treaty that he thought was in our interest. We weren't going to cut off our nose to spite their face in that way. But we would consistently remind Moscow that linkage was an inescapable fact of life, and we would not fail to respond to Soviet encroachments on our interests in one area out of fear that by doing so we would jeopardize the possibility of agreement in another area. In other words, we would not practice reverse linkage on ourselves. Now, needless to say, it turned out to be much easier to proclaim these strategic guidelines in theory than to follow them in practice. Real-world developments have refused to conform to a prearranged script, and our actual interactions with Moscow over the past 7 years have involved innumerable ad hoc adjustments to unexpected and perhaps unforeseeable constraints and opportunities. But nevertheless, I would submit that the Reagan administration's policy toward the USSR has been remarkably consistent as such things go. And furthermore, which isn't the same thing, I would submit that it's been a remarkably successful policy. And I am talking now about policy toward the Soviet Union, not toward other areas where I would not advance that claim personally. Now, as I read it, the positive side of the balance sheet to date looks something like this. To start with, I think there has been a distinct shift toward realism in public perceptions of the superpower relationship. Public opinion seems far less susceptible to the sort of manic depressive cycles that have made it so difficult in the past for us to conduct a balanced policy. I'm struck, for example, by the ready acceptance of what I would perhaps shock you by suggesting is the sophisticated message for which President Reagan has been a medium. Namely, the message that the Soviet Union, on the one hand, is an evil empire. And just ask the Poles or the Afghans, or for that matter, Soviet Jews, if you think that is mere rhetoric. Evil empire with which it is impossible for us to have normal, let alone friendly relations. That on the one hand. But at the same time, the second part of the message, the Soviet Union is a potential partner in an unprecedentedly sweeping security arms control deal. Now, there isn't any contradiction between these two perceptions of the USSR, in fact. But until recently, many of us, I think, would have found the two perceptions difficult, if not impossible, to reconcile. That so many of us now take it for granted that we can and should support the Afghan Mujahideen, while simultaneously concluding an agreement to dismantle intermediate-range ballistic missiles. That, I submit, is a major change and an improvement, and one for which the administration can, I believe, take some credit. Now, we've also made progress in redressing the military balance, and more broadly and importantly, in redressing what the Soviets call the global correlation of forces. Although not all of our increased defense spending has been optimally allocated from a military point of view, our force structure and our force posture have been much enhanced. Furthermore, we have reestablished our credentials as a tough, on-the-ground competitor. Grenada may not have been our finest hour. The bombing of Libya may not have achieved all of its objectives, but they demonstrated that the U.S. was prepared to use force and to use its own forces when this was the only way to defend its interests. Small actions in themselves, they were nonetheless noted around the world as evidence that the U.S. might finally be recovered from the crippling effects of the Vietnam Syndrome, and taken together with the repeal of the Clark Amendment, if you'll remember, forbid U.S. aid to insurgent forces in Angola, and taken together with the authorization by Congress of aid to the Contras, as well as to the Afghan insurgents. They were actions that lent credibility to the President's claim that the U.S. was back as an active competitor after a long period of withdrawal. Now, as for negotiations, as I see it, the record is also one of which the administration can take some justifiable pride. For starters, the administration has stuck to its guns. It's refused to entertain arms control proposals that are unequitable and unverifiable and fail to make a real contribution to Western security, despite considerable continuing pressure to make those kinds of agreements. Initially, lots of folk accused us, because I do identify with this part of the administration's record, of putting forward proposals that were non-negotiable, proposals that proved that the administration was not seriously interested in arms control. But thanks to the administration's perseverance, and thanks to its evident determination to build up unless and until the Soviets agreed to build down, many of these allegedly non-negotiable proposals have turned out, in fact, to be negotiable. This is clearly the case with regard to INF, the zero option. All of us who were sitting in Washington at that time were beaten on for 3 years about what a ridiculous idea it was to think that the Soviets would dismantle all of their SS-20 missiles in Europe. That's what they now are proposing. That's certainly true of INF, and there are encouraging signs of Soviet movement on strategic weapons as well. Now, the administration has also stuck to its guns in refusing to let arms control allow arms control to completely overshadow other outstanding items on its East-West agenda. Despite Moscow's objections, regional issues and human rights issues have continued to be part of the superpower dialogue, and at least a few of our messages do appear to have gotten through. Sufficient perhaps to mention the release of Andrei Sakharov and other prominent dissidents who owe their newfound freedom to a multitude of factors, including factors in domestic Soviet politics, but who would almost certainly still be in prison or in exile if the administration had not made it clear to the Soviet leaders that their fate was a matter of grave concern in the highest quarters in Washington. Now, all of this once said, I don't want to leave the impression that I think things are going swimmingly or that I see anything like clear sailing ahead. All of the achievements that I've noted are fragile, and problems and pitfalls clearly abound. To begin with, our very successes often create substantial difficulties. And a case in point is the apparently emergent INF Treaty, U.S.-Soviet agreement to remove intermediate-range missiles from Europe. As you're all presumably aware, the prospect of the removals of our missiles has reawakened all of the anxieties of our European allies about the firmness of the U.S. commitment to their defense. And it's created serious new strains in the alliance, the sort of typical European schizophrenia with which all American policymakers have to deal. You endanger us by putting your missiles in. You're not defending or you're threatening the credibility of deterrence if you take your missiles out. But there's no question that this agreement, as letters and op-ed pieces by Henry Kissinger and President Nixon and others indicate, that this agreement that is emerging is very problematic in terms of alliance relations. To make matters worse, it's also clear that the domestic consensus on the need for a continuing U.S. defense buildup is unraveling and could unravel altogether in the face of mounting budgetary pressures. It's just perfectly clear that the kind of money that we have been spending on defense until recently is not going to be authorized by a Congress of any political complexion again in the foreseeable future. It's also far from certain that the Vietnam syndrome is really behind us. Despite Grenada and Libya, our willingness to use our military muscle to support our diplomacy remains very much in doubt. Lebanon may have been a much more relevant test than Libya or Grenada, and what it showed, perhaps, was that the death of 200 Marines was enough to make a crucial aspect of an effective Middle East policy unsustainable in the United States. What it showed was that the Pentagon, what Lebanon showed, was that the Pentagon had certainly not recovered from the Vietnam syndrome. And a debate took place of which the American public should have been very proud. It was founding fathers kind of talk, as Rhodes Scholar Weinberger debated Dr. Schultz about the use of force, and the Secretary of State said you can't have a diplomacy that's credible if you are unwilling to use force, and the Secretary of Defense, the reputed hawk, said you can't use American forces unless you guarantee that they will come out of it with an acceptable level of deaths, with victory, and so forth and so on. And you certainly can't use them in peripheral engagements because they're there to deter the Soviet Union. And the Secretary of Defense and the entire Pentagon certainly was not willing to back the Secretary of State in using force. So the Vietnam syndrome may not be behind us. Furthermore, despite Congress's continued funding of activities associated with the so-called Reagan Doctrine, it's not even certain that the American public is prepared to support others to fight the expansion of Soviet power on its, the American public's, behalf. Even continued support for the Afghan insurgents could become domestically contentious as a result of deteriorating U.S.-Pakistani relations that are clearly in the cards, the deterioration of relations. Continued support for the Contras and for the UNITA forces in Angola certainly cannot be taken for granted, to say the least. Now, these actual and foreseeable problems would be considerably more troubling were it not for the fact that Moscow apparently feels the need for something of a respite, a breathing space in the superpower competition. Moscow feels its need partly because it can no longer gain ground almost by default in the superpower competition, as we allowed it to do during the 1970s. A more important factor, perhaps, is Gorbachev's realization that too ambitious and too muscular a Soviet foreign policy could interfere with his efforts to get the sluggish Soviet economy moving again. Something he realizes that he has to do if the USSR is to remain competitive over the longer run. If the USSR, as Gorbachev has put it, is to enter the 21st century in a manner worthy of a great power. Now, Gorbachev has tried hard to persuade the outside world that his pursuit of this objective, the objective of entering the 21st century in a manner worthy of a great power, tried to persuade us that his pursuit of this objective will be accompanied by a completely new look in Soviet foreign policy. He and his spokesman have claimed that Moscow is ready and eager to make major compromises in order to settle outstanding disputes in a manner that enhances the mutual security, a new term in Moscow's lexicon, the mutual security of all of the parties to the dispute. But to date, the changes that he has introduced in Soviet foreign policy, in my judgment, have been largely cosmetic, and there's very little evidence to suggest that he is any more willing than his predecessors to address the underlying security concerns of other states. The only arguable exception is arms control. And here I would suggest that Gorbachev's initiatives are less the result of a newfound Soviet concern for mutual security than they are the result of a belief that Pershing IIs and MXs and space-based capabilities, U.S. missiles and emergent U.S. SDI capabilities, that it's his belief that these are much more effective than the Soviet systems that they're designed to counter, that has in fact driven him to make what are indeed unprecedentedly forthcoming arms control proposals, no matter how much mischief may ensue from our adoption of those proposals, which are our own. So in short, if the Soviets are indeed finally ready to build down, and I stress the if because the agreements haven't been signed yet, I would argue it's mostly because we have finally been ready to build up. Now, arms control apart, Gorbachev's foreign policy initiatives haven't amounted to much, at least not yet. He certainly has shown no indications of a willingness to address the underlying security concerns of the Germans, which have to do with the division of Germany and the presence of huge numbers of Soviet divisions in East Germany. Despite a certain amount of talk, he certainly has shown no willingness to address the underlying security concerns of the Japanese, the so-called Northern Territories, the 4 Japanese islands that the Soviets have not only seized but militarized and increasingly militarized, remain under Soviet control. He has done nothing to address the basic underlying security concerns of China. He did, it is true, withdraw a symbolic division from Mongolia. The 3 other divisions in Mongolia whose withdrawal China has demanded stay in place. And the withdrawal of one division is militarily utterly insignificant. In Afghanistan, again, a major concern of the Chinese as well as of ours, as well as of ourselves, Gorbachev announced a small troop withdrawal and then bungled the cover so badly that it was absolutely clear that, in fact, the only unit that was being withdrawn was a unit that had been badly mangled in an engagement with the Afghan Mujahideen. But nothing has come out of Afghanistan. And Soviet hints in UN-Afghan associated negotiations that a withdrawal might be in the offing under certain conditions, thus far remain awfully elusive. Furthermore, the Soviets continued to play very rough indeed. It's far from home, not close to our borders, We don't often pay much attention, therefore, but cross-border raids and hot pursuit raids into Pakistan by Soviet and Afghan forces have escalated dramatically under Gorbachev. Pakistan is, the northwest frontier areas of Pakistan are being regularly bombed now by Soviets. In Nicaragua, the Soviets have just made large new commitments of economic aid, and the Cuban-Soviet proxy presence has increased, as it has increased in Angola. Under Gorbachev, Soviet defense spending continues, according to our best estimates, to run at about 13 to 15% of GNP. And on the human rights front, to mention it, as important as the release of Sakharov and other dissidents is, other prominent dissidents is, the majority of Soviet dissidents remain for the nonce in jail. Despite small increases in the emigration of Soviet Jews and Soviet Germans and Soviet Armenians, the three groups that are allowed to emigrate, there has been nothing like the outpouring that Soviet spokesmen have hinted at, and indeed there have been changes in Soviet law that are clearly designed to make it clear that there will not be a resumption, that the regime does not want there to be a resumption of the kind of emigration that we saw in the 70s. Now, all of this suggests to me that skepticism about an emergent strategic reorientation of Soviet foreign policy should be the order of the day. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that it is the order of the day, at least not sufficiently. Despite the fact that I earlier expressed some confidence about a shift toward realism in public perceptions of the USSR, a recent New York Times op-ed headline calling upon us to root for Gorbachev gave me a little bit of pause, made me wonder whether my confidence that realism was back was justified. I haven't yet seen any references to Uncle Misha in the American press, but the Soviet PR machine is working overtime, and who knows what could happen if the Soviet PR machine were to find, for example, a new Samantha Smith, so that we could all sort of love Gorbachev's fatherly impulses and peace-loving impulses. Now, I don't want to conclude on a completely cynical, let alone facetious note. I don't believe that the Soviets are completely incorrigible. I do not exclude the possibility that real change is underway. What I do believe is that the strategic guidelines that Secretary Shultz laid out in 1982 are still valid and still represent our best bet for protecting our own interests and the interests of our friends and allies, while simultaneously teaching the Soviets what we want them to learn and what I believe they're capable of learning. Namely, that the costs and risks of intimidation and aggression outweigh the potential payoffs. And that means keeping the costs and risks high to them. And we want them to learn that the benefits of cooperation are attainable at a reasonable price, but not a going out of business price. We don't want to go out of business in pursuit of cooperation with the Soviet Union. Now, if we can show some real stamina in this regard, I think there's a real possibility that the magnitude and urgency of the Soviet challenge will gradually decline. The Soviet Union is in bad economic trouble. It is possible that Gorbachev is entertaining possibilities of political change that will make it a less unpleasant country to deal with. But if we are naive and credulous instead of realistic, if we are vacillating instead of resolute, if we're capitulationist instead of conciliatory, then I think we may well have to contend, as we enter the 21st century, with a competitor, a Soviet competitor, that's as relentless and unscrupulous as the one we have to deal with now, but is considerably more self-confident and more efficient. And that's not a very pleasant prospect from my point of view. So I would feel better if I thought that in the next 7 years, we would be as consistent and as successful in the pursuit of our interests and management of the superpower relationship as I really think we have been over the past 7 years.
Dr. Azrael, we thank you very much for that thorough exposition of your own views and an explanation also of the administration's. Yes, sir.
Well, when I came here, of course, I was looking for something refreshing in the way of U.S.-SR relations, and I discovered the same old Reagan propaganda line. Do you consider that the United States is really tough, and indeed acted in a very tough way by invading the tiny little island of NATO, by shooting down Libya, which is a country far poorer than we are, and where the terrorism, frankly, was never proved. When we are at the threshold, like, for example, Reykjavik, and opening up in the sense of the country, I think, the desire on the part of the people for this thing to really succeed, to open up to really healthy, intercultural, international relationships. So the Reagan administration lovely. So are we really such? Are we really tough, or are we just going around, as you say, throwing our guns around?
Well, for that first question, we do thank you. I assured Dr. Azrael that we very seldom have long statements before questions. And so I'll ask you, though, as you ask further questions, to try to make them as brief as possible.
A word of defense, I guess, if it's the same old stuff, Reagan propaganda, as you call it, I guess the reason that I chose to reflect back on what kind of a strategy we were trying to lay out is because people, it seems to me, have forgotten what we were trying to get away from. And it seems to me you need that baseline in order to make any kind of an assessment. And you need a bit of the historical background in order to draw some lessons out of our experiences, whatever they are, over the past few years. So I didn't really mean to be a propagandist at all. The last point you raise strikes me as indicative of self-entrapment and reverse linkage, which I think is very dangerous. If I heard you correctly, what you said was, gee, wasn't it bad to do these things on the eve of Reykjavik, which was so full of promise? Well, I infer that what came out of Reykjavik, in your opinion, is pretty promising. And what I think that demonstrates is that the Soviets are grown up, just as we are or ought to be, and that they're perfectly capable of conducting a dialogue and making proposals that are in their interests, even when unpleasant things are happening to their clients, and that they are as ready to live in a world in which you talk arms control and practice national liberation today as they were to live in that world in the 1970s, when that was, after all, what they stated as their preferred position. You know, on Grenada and Libya, the point I would make, I would argue that Libya's complicity in very ugly terrorism is not proven. There's something wrong with the judicial process that reached the judgment, because the weight of evidence seems to be overwhelming. But just as I think it's perfectly clear that Grenada was in the process of being converted into a Cuban satellite, which would provide the Soviets with all kinds of facilities that not only we preferred they not have, but all their immediate neighbors clearly, greatly preferred they not have. That isn't really my point. The broad point would be the Schultz-Weinberger dialogue, a diplomacy having defined our interests that cannot be backed by the use of force as a last resort is a failed diplomacy. And it seems to me the American public has to wrestle with that and decide whether it wants to be in the foreign policy business, which is what its post-war history suggests, or whether it wants to revert to a splendid isolationism in which it doesn't conduct a superpower diplomacy and discharge what I think of as its international responsibilities. But if it decides it does want to discharge those responsibilities, it cannot hope to do so long as it imposes a de facto ban on the use of force, not in a competition with Moscow.
Yes, sir.
Could you speculate on the success or failures of Soviet policy?
The question, in case you didn't hear it, was would Dr. Azrael speculate on the success and failures of Soviet foreign policy?
Oh, you know, half full, half empty, like ours. I mean, I'm perfectly serious. I mean, you know, as I'm sure you can write the script either way. Certainly, historically, it's been a massively successful foreign policy by what I take to be the canons of the regime itself. You know, Eastern Europe, I mean, the history is important. That Soviet imperialism is something special, or Russian imperialism. I mean, it started in Moscow. You know, and then over the centuries, it got 11 time zones in defense of its insecure borders for Moscow. And then it came along, and this was its own self-definition, and it said, we need friendly states in Eastern Europe because we're insecure in our 11 time zones. And it achieved that important objective. You know, now that can be defined as a failure. Moscow is the only country in the world that's completely surrounded by hostile communist states. You know, that's a failure, not a success. And I think one could go on and on in that vein. It got Eastern Europe, but got NATO. You know, consolidated a Western alliance, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, sir.
Dr. Azrael, you mentioned that Gorbachev was opposed to German reunification. Now, what is the American policy about German reunification, or your policy, or the administration's policy in that case?
American policy has always been that it looks forward to the peaceful reunification of Germany. And if you would like to have a conversation in Bonn in which you fail to say that to German government officials, good luck to you. I mean, there's no question of what U.S. policy is. And that is the opposite of Soviet policy. I'm convinced that not all Frenchmen and Britishers who say the same thing mean it in their hearts. Yeah, I know. I understood what you were getting. I think the world has changed sufficiently, and Germany has changed sufficiently that I, in fact, would welcome a peaceful reunification of Germany, although I understand the apprehensions.
Yes, ma'am.
Are the Congress a way to control Russia and Central America, or is there another way?
Are the Contras a way of controlling the Russians in Central America, or is there another or better way?
You pay your money, you take your choice, you try to make good judgments, and they're hard calls, it seems to me. The Contras are, just not the best conceivable asset that those of us who would contain Soviet penetration could have. I'd rather use the Marines, personally. On the other hand, the best judgment I have been able to reach is that the Sandinistas, despite their pretty good front men working the U.S., I'm going back to Los Angeles tomorrow to talk to Georgy Arbatov. Communist systems can have very suave and urbane frontmen. The best judgment I have been able to reach on the basis of my information, which is not much different than yours, is that the Sandinistas really are a centralized, tightly controlled communist movement with a positive commitment to Cuba/Moscow, and that slash covers a lot of ambiguities too, but that they're real bad guys themselves.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Azrael, don't you believe, do you believe that military intervention in Central America is a way to improve the situation rather than perceive economic help? Countries that are so objecting to it, they grab at anything that comes from the outside help. And soldiers who shoot won't change for the better, in my opinion.
The question was, is military intervention really a better tool in Central America than longer-range economic answers?
Yeah, I don't think they're mutually inconsistent. I think there are certainly problems with economic assistance too, namely getting it used effectively and so on. But I think probably we reneged on an important commitment when having properly sent troops to Grenada to shift but stay close to Central America, who were indubitably welcomed by the people of Grenada, who had a bunch of authentic thugs dominating them and with the help of the Cubans. Having sent troops, having solved the problem, having shot some people, and not got shot in return, which made it tolerable from the point of view of a lot of Americans, we really didn't do as well as we should have done, in my opinion, in the economic aid area. What economic aid we did provide, I'm told, was pretty much squandered, as much of our economic aid is, and sinkholes are sinkholes on occasion. But I don't think there's any contradiction between helping people improve their lives economically and helping people rid themselves of unwelcome political regimes, and certainly whatever else you can say about most Soviet-associated political regimes, they don't do much for the people economically. That may be why, I hope that they will, may be why they attract some initial support. But there's an awful lot of historical record that says that isn't the best way to raise the living standard.
Yes, in the rear.
Do the figures in the State Department rather like the prospect of dealing with Secretary Gorbachev or the future of the Soviet Union, or would they rather deal with somebody else? And depending upon your answer, is there any thinking about the steps the United States could go to support Secretary Gorbachev? What must be the two? From his point of view, about the perilous undertaking.
Sure, anybody who thinks about the Soviet Union says, you know, is it the worse the better, or the better the better? I mean, you know, and they, you know, you then get into the question of what is a Gorbachev and what are his prospects and things that would certainly be a different topic for another talk, and I would love to have. But in you asked about the State Department or the U.S. government, you know, the fate of Soviet leaders. I mean, it's a great big country that mostly moves to its own, marches to its own drums, moves to its own rhythms. And I don't think, and certainly there are some people who agree with me, that there is very much the United States government can do one way or the other to help or to hinder Gorbachev in his efforts to transform that country. You know, if the transformation produces a more efficient, tougher competitor, it's probably inimical to our interests, but I don't think we can do very much to prevent it. There are some things that we ought to do to protect some economic resources, strategic trade, and so on in our own interest. But, you know, even I am not so wishful a thinker as to think after recent experience that you could get American farmers to sacrifice income in terms of grain in order to pursue strategic objectives vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. But what do you do to you know, to help Gorbachev to the degree you can think of anything? Seems to me the way you help him in his self-proclaimed effort to transform the Soviet Union and act externally in accord with other people's mutual security is to put him in a position where he can constantly say to his so-called hawks, Jesus, I can't follow your advice because those guys will hit us. You know, that's really dangerous and risky. I've got this fragile country here. I'm engaged in these economic experiments. You know, I can't run high risks out there of the sort you're urging. And you have to make him credible when he says to them, those are high risks. The United States said, well, we're going to get hit. And we don't want to be hit while we're weak and vulnerable and fragile. So I think of myself as one of his best friends in advocating the pursuit of the sorts of policy, American policies that his predecessors failed to deal with adequately from the point of view of Russian national interest, and that he's apparently decided have to be dealt with by making some significant concessions to the West. I think that's a good outcome from our point of view and his.
Mr. Jacobs, and then the gentleman next to him if he still has a question.
There is a popular picture of Brezhnev on one hand, Gorbachev on the other, both as prisoners, either of the Politburo or of the Army alternatively, depending on who you're listening to. judge until this last answer from you that you saw very little distinction between the two. But I have the impression from this popular meeting that one was a complacent, happy prisoner. The other is a restless, eager prisoner of the Politburo. It can hardly wait to shake off some of these 70 and 80-year-olds before he moves out on his own. Is that something that you believe? Is this another Khrushchev who's going to come to the same sort of Khrushchev ending? Or is it another Brezhnev?
We don't know, is the answer. There is no question that this Soviet leader, like every Soviet leader, like every person in his office, has a great deal of power and an almost exclusive power to take initiatives. There's also no question in my mind that this Soviet leader faces a lot of opposition among his colleagues in leadership, and out there in the bureaucracy, and out there at the grassroots. It's very uncertain whether he will be, his initiatives, whether his writ will in fact run through the land, or what the consequences of his attempts to enforce his writ are likely to be. If you're going to make that place somewhat efficient, you're going to do some very dramatic things, and it's important to get the Soviet Union right. 25% of its budget goes to an agricultural subsidy to keep meat cheap, and eggs cheap, and milk cheap, so everybody can afford it. He can't pay that kind of subsidy if he does what he wants to do, which is to invest in modern machine building industries to computerize the country and so forth and so on. Means he's got to raise prices. Well, that's what the Poles rioted about, and the Soviets, it terrifies the Soviet leadership. Is he going to do it, and what are the consequences going to be? Are the resistors merely stodgy old men, or are they his best and brightest domestic intelligence people who say, man, you're sitting on a cauldron, and you do that. We understand what you're saying about efficiency, Mikhail Sergeyevich, but you're going to have riots in Moscow. There are different ways to think about that. He's in a system in which he says, I want to promote people on the basis of competence and efficiency, and all our little technocratic hearts vibrate, and so on. He's in a multinational country, where the best and the brightest, which perhaps some of you will sort of identify with him, are mostly white middle-class folk. And about 30% of his population consists of Central Asian Muslims, who are not, by technocratic standards, the best and the brightest. They won't do well on the SAT tests. They don't speak standard Russian. They speak their own languages. They've been to rural schools, segregated rural schools, and so forth and so on. Well, it's bloody dangerous to start saying, I'm going to change the established policy, which is, what did we call it, preferential advantage, affirmative action, and I'm going to go for straight equality on the basis of standardized tests. You don't have to just be a conservative old man to say, hey, wait a minute, this is very complicated, and do you really mean it? So, all of those issues, getting that system moving again, getting it moving in the way that he says he wants to get it moving, is not going to be easy, and people are going to have knockdown, drag-out debates over what's the right way to do it. And when some decisions are made, they're going to be contradictory, and they may or may not work, and the outcome is unpredictable, and then he may be blamed for the failure, or he may not. He was, after all, the man who was in charge of Soviet agriculture for 7 years, 6 of which were almost total disasters. For that, he got elected General Secretary. This is not a system that enforces accountability always for failure, although sometimes it does. So I don't know the answer to your question, I guess is what I'm saying.
Considering the infighting you described, do you have a reading as to how long Gorbachev had in terms of achieving some quote-unquote success for Bosnia?
Yeah, you know, I mean, the first 100 days are over. The first 1,000 days are drawing near, and some folk are beginning to say, you know, the system isn't moving yet, or at least fast enough, whatever that means. But it isn't, you know, it isn't a democratic system. I mean, only a very few people matter in deciding whether he stays or goes, at least in terms of proximate action. And we don't know very much, you know, about that. I mean, it's the accountability point there. Some of my Sovietological colleagues are having learned debates on television, I gather. He's going to be here in 4 months, or he's going to be here, he isn't going to be here in 4 months, or what have you. I don't know of an iota of evidence that would enable one to think about those things.
Ms. Morris?
I'm curious, before you back to the arms control, what do you think is the role of the SDI, both in terms of United States policy and USS acceptance or lack of acceptance in the light of this current INF movement?
I think that the Soviets accepted our INF proposal, creating certain problems for us, because we deployed missiles. We've done what we said. And that didn't have a whole lot to do with SDI, although the deployment of the missiles and the Strategic Defense Initiative were all part of this building up process that I think has made them more conciliatory, at least in this area. It seems to me that SDI is about the only plausible explanation for why they have agreed to talk about deep cuts in their strategic offensive missile forces, not the INF forces, but strategic forces. I was working in town, or that town down the road, when poor Cy Vance went off to Moscow for Jimmy Carter right after Carter was inaugurated, to suggest to the Soviets that we wanted deep cuts in Soviet offensive missile forces. And he was sent home by Gromyko with his tail between his legs. He was dressed down. He was told never. And Washington, that part of Washington that mattered, not Brzezinski's part, said, oh, we can't ask them for deep cuts. And when the Reagan administration came in and asked for deep cuts, everybody said, you know, we were just ignoring the experience of the past. The Soviets would never give us deep cuts, and so forth and so on. The MX, a buildup of our own strategic forces, plus SDI, got their attention, and they started talking differently, very differently. Now, I personally have sufficient doubts about SDI that I'd like to clinch the deal with them right now while it's still good before Congress guts the funding for SDI, which is sure to happen whether or not SDI, you know, is viable and whatever one means by SDI. But it was immensely important, it seems to me, in focusing their attention. They have been in the strategic defensive business for a very long time. And what they were being told was, oh God, it was like being in the moon business. The Americans are now getting mobilized, and they're going to get there first, even though we've been in the business for much longer. And I think it was, you know, if you believe it's a system that can't work, all its cost, it's an expensive rabbit pulled down of a hat. It's been a fantastic rabbit in terms of producing offers from our principal adversary in the world to please, it looks to us like a lion, we're ready to give you all our lambs, take away the rabbit, it's a great rabbit. I mean, the president should be forever applauded for it by those who are strong fans of deep reductions in Soviet offensive missiles.
We have time for just, I apologize. You always see two hands, and then you go to say there's time for two questions, and there are 8 hands in the air. I'm going to have to discriminate badly, and I apologize. The first in order I know is on the far side of the aisle, and the last question will have to be yours, sir. And I apologize to everyone else.
Going back to your favorite word, historical syndromes, and you use the term Vietnam syndrome. Let me go right another syndrome field, because I wonder what syndrome is operating in Foggy Bottom. Let's use the John Foster Dulles syndrome, and the last great exponent of Dulles is Mr. Reagan. So if you were a Dulles syndrome advocate, you would say it's perfectly all right to send the Marines to Nicaragua. But if you were a Vietnam syndrome advocate, you would say, hey, how about sending the Marines out to Chile? Where do we go?
I guess in the framework I am, I'm saying as long as you are prepared to send the Marines in as a last resort in support of what you think are foreign policy priorities, and as long as those are constitutionally determined rather than determined in back rooms and funny and so on. Then we'll have, then pursue the argument. I mean, for purposes of tonight, my major question, I wanted to be what I think is Schultz's. If you can't use force, how the hell can you do it? Play a major international role. I know that's an inadequate answer from your point of view, but I mean, it really is the.
I'm confused a bit by some of the presentation. There is a reputation in some of the discussions with Gorbachev was as a revolutionary. Somewhat the army took over and he was a general. He actually was elected or appointed by the politburo, the very old men that the flying line. They would never appoint if they thought he was going to be a revolutionary. So I'm suggesting that maybe we're looking at him differently. He's just like these feel up plan. Just like there's a lot of gamblers in the shows. And I think Gorbachev playing gambling with us like that. That's bankrupt. Say, go ahead, spend your money, spend it. I'm afraid he knows it's not going to work. But more importantly, I think he's just he's evolutionary. He's not different than any other guy that's ever had. So you say he's trying to do these things. I think he's also trying to chess. You got to be very careful with that. Repeat the question.
I think
revolutionary or is it actually just
I've been a serious student of Soviet affairs for 3 decades plus now, and we certainly appreciate his sharing that parts of that long experience with us. Your presentation, Jeremy, I think was filled with insight and humor and was ultimately serious. We appreciate you fitting us in on your cross-country jet hops and sharing your time with us.